Do you have halls?
Nandun sa mismong sa counter, meron isa.
Mhm.
Okay na ba si Bambi? Tignan, baka magulo tayo, maraming bibigyan. Ako nag-pink, saka mag-red scarf.
Isa lang, pink and red. Pwede rin pink and red. Kung wala kang preference.
Combination. Bongbong Marcos is not our president. Mahal ko siya. Sa lakas.
Sino yun? Yung si Calio Di.
Yung vice president,
Presidential mo yun.
presidential mo ba siya?
Hindi niya nga yung binoto ni Joboy. Calio Di. Yun, NPA yun. Si Joboy, kulang mo. Sakin, ang pasis.
Si Bintay,
Eh, yun ang mga kasi.
baka kaibigan niya.
Kaibigan niya, kung BBM. Hindi pa ano rin. Kung dapat yun.
Di pa, baka ano ata.
Pwede. Patugalan na. Eh sila, sigaw rally. Diba? General tatay nila eh. Zanya, di ba magkakabatch ang mga general kaya ano, Ilocano pa eh. Ang mga yung Marcos.
Yeah, I know.
Baka nakalimutan nila meron na yun. May message.
Are we good to go? Yeah. Where did we leave off?
Saan tayo natapos?
Mm-hmm.
Let me check my notes. It's been a while. February 10, 17, 24 February. Yung biblical authors, we will analogy. What analogy?
What session?
Session 20.
Session 20. Okay, that means we're session 21.
Plots and subplots.
Subtitle. 21 tayo. Para ka daw candy. I hear the
All right. So we're just going to get started. I'm going to open us up in prayer, and then we'll just hit the ground running. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for another time back to once again get into the groove of studying your word in a different and more underworked capacity than we're typically used to. Lord, as we continue to work these muscles and as we continue to gain these tools, Lord, would you be with us as we practice? In your name we pray. Amen. So we are beginning our session 21, which is characterization and setting in biblical narrative. So it's been a while since we've been back, but we spent a lot of time talking about plot in biblical narrative, right? There was a lot we talked about. We talked about different plot devices, how plot weaves in and out. There's so much to talk about. And what we learned about plot is that it's a way to talk about the littlest and largest levels of narrative in the Bible. So we're going to consider a little bit more briefly the elements within plot, such as character and style within biblical narrative, and then also setting, mostly because the way that those work are filled out by the last step, which we'll take, which is design patterns and hyperlinking. But again, we're going to go back to our universal narrative elements. Okay, plot line, a sequence of events, right? Which is sort of like sequence of events, and it escalates to a narrative point. Would you like to get water? A sequence of events that escalates into resolution. And then obviously the next component is characters, the agents within these little sequenced events, these little plots, so the characters who stand in them. These characters are the people who undergo the events, right? Characters, if you think about the little story that we talked about months ago about Billy and his mom and cookies, right? We talked about how characters play important roles there. Characters are also critical elements of the moral or ethical message of any story, right? The way that characters are portrayed clue us into the moral and ethical message of the narrative. So I'm going to let an Israeli scholar, Shimon Bar Efrat, say it because he says it better than I'm able to. He says, most of an author's view of the world and the values they want to communicate are embodied in the narrative and expressed through the characters. Not only do characters serve as a narrative mouthpiece, but also what is and is not related about them, which of their personality traits are emphasized and which are not. These all reveal the ethical values and moral norms within the narratives. The decisions of the characters are called upon to make when confronted with moral choices, and then the results of their decisions provide indisputable evidence of a narrative ethical dimension. So all that to say is that characters are not simply agents within the story. They are design elements chosen and crafted and shaped to communicate moral and ethical values. That is to say, when Abraham chooses to take his, in Genesis 12, when the call of Abraham is given, and he's asked by God to leave the land of his fathers and his family and go into a new land, and Abraham takes his nephew, that's a moral choice. And we should read it as a moral choice. We should read it as part of the ethical dimension of Abraham and the final statement of the author. So the results that the decisions that our characters enact, they provide evidence for a moral, narrative, and ethical dimension. For example, this is an example that has challenged especially Christian readers over the years of the Hebrew Bible over the years. It's polygamy. I think we covered this the last time, but I'll just reiterate. Polygamy in these stories, there's lots of male characters who have multiple wives. And there are many cultures within our, in our globe today for whom this is the thing. Polygamy is allowed, sometimes venerated. This is how they operate, and sometimes it is what is traditional. So if you think of the coping strategies that we talked about way back when we were first talking about the Bible, we often use the coping strategy for difficult passages of the hero exemplary model, which is that we take a character within the Bible, and then because they pose difficult questions for us to answer, we moralize them, we make them heroes and examples which we should follow. And oftentimes that's a coping strategy that causes you to flatten a character or to misread a decision that a character makes and have to fit it into a moral framework that is easy to get, right? And so how much of the lives of any single character should be an example is a difficult question to answer on first pass. It takes a good amount of study to finally get to which part of Abraham's life is worth following and which part is actually something that we should be cautioned against, right? So the question becomes, is it their own struggle and choice? Or maybe there are more things about the way of life, like polygamy, that are being set as an ideal before me? These are the questions we ought to ask. And so there have been different offshoots of the Christian tradition who see a divine warrant for, male-led household with multiple wives. So if you know the history of American tradition, there was the Latter-day Saints. So the Latter-day Saints absolutely allows this kind of behavior. And they see biblical warrant for it. And that may be what happened in the lives of these characters, right? The question is, how does the narrative... So, say this is Abraham, and at a point in his life, he has who? Sarah. But he has other women in his life. Hagar, right? Or you have Jacob. We could use Jacob here. Rachel and Leah. And the maidservants. Both of them had maidservants that they misused, right? And so that is a plain fact in the biblical narrative, and the characters are making a decision. But once again, this is not a historical retelling. It's a design narrative. And if there is a design narrative, that means there is an evaluation that the author is making. So the question we need to ask, Jacob had Leah and Rachel and then the maidservants. How does the narrative evaluate those facts? Does it work out well for them? Does it spell trouble? It spells lots of trouble for Jacob, right? And so that's when we have to go back to studying design properly and not simply heroizing one of our main characters, right? They're flawed figures. Many times they're tragic figures, right? Like Solomon is a quite tragic figure, right? Solomon, at the end, the height of David's empire is fractured and rebellion is afoot, right? And so we're back again to plot and character molding, how plot ends up molding the character and how the author will evaluate the character. So my question is, what is the ideal in the garden narrative in terms of union of male and female? In the Garden of Eden. What is the ideal in the garden narrative? In the garden narrative, right? So that means if you look at your narrative, there is an ideal that's set forth, right? In terms of the union of male and female. Okay? That is kind of, right? But in the garden narrative, there's more said. Right? And so if you read Genesis, a man will leave his father and mother, be joined to his wife, and the two will become one. And so isn't it interesting that every single character in the Hebrew Bible who doesn't live by that ideal ends up in very disastrous situations precisely because of their multiple marriages. You could say that the entire Joseph narrative is predicated because he favored the child of one wife, right? Who he loved more. And extending his disdain for Leah, he worked those children to the bone, right? And so it's the case whether it's Abraham, whether it's Jacob, whether it's David, whether it's Solomon, right? So then you have to step back and you have to say, it might have been way easier for the biblical authors to just say that you shouldn't have multiple wives, right? If the biblical authors had just said, here's the standard for marriage, don't have multiple wives, right? We believe that God is speaking through us, don't have multiple wives. But instead, they don't do that. They give you a narrative where they refuse to comment on the actions of any one character, right? Very rarely do we get an actual, aside from the author, telling us evaluating an action of a character. What we're given is a narrative that plays out with a conclusion, with more begged questions or branching storylines, right? And we have to read it carefully, right? Instead, the narrative gives us an ideal, and then you just have to watch the characters deviate from the ideal. And then you learn, oh, these are the many multiple ways this can fracture and deviate. And then the narrative consequences are the author's evaluation of the events, right? The consequences that are given to us narratively are the author's evaluation. There are actually a few more layers of complexity to even just the husband and wife thing. But what it shows us is that biblical poetic style, the narrator, so in biblical poetic style, the narrator is just as often, if not more than often, evaluating the consequences. It's too much to write. I'm not going to write it. What I'm trying to say here is that in biblical poetic style, in the way that the biblical authors wrote, the narrator is often, if not just as more than often, evaluating the decisions of the characters by narrating the consequences. Right? The evaluation is the way that they narrate the consequences, and putting the ball in your court to make the connection. This is very rabbinical, right? There's an old joke that goes around in a lot of Jewish circles where if you ask the rabbi a question, they'll answer with 5 more questions, right? And so they're often trying to grow you in your wisdom tradition by asking difficult questions, right? And you occasionally get the narrator sometimes coming in and saying, and so what they did was actually evil, right? In the eyes of the Lord. Sometimes we get that narratively. But it's actually not as common as you think. And usually it's already functioning as a narrative point, right? And so more often the strategy of the narrator will be to show the consequences of people's choices, and it's up to us to evaluate whether or not those are good consequences, right? So when Moses goes out and he sees his fellow Israelites being oppressed, and he murders the Egyptian taskmaster, the author does not evaluate for us whether or not he should have murdered the Egyptian, right? We don't get that answer, right? On first pass, if we're working off the hero model, we will heroize that, right? Only to find out later on that Moses' temper has always been a problem for Moses. So much so that one of the 10 commandments is do not murder, right? So the narrator doesn't comment on Moses' action, but it does end up with him having to be expelled from Egypt. He flees. And does it ever land him in a good place? Arguably, where he ended up was not good. He was meandering somewhere in the desert, and God had to wrangle him back, right? And so, in fact, it's what gets him disqualified from entering in the promised land. It's the same sin that disqualifies David from building the temple, right? When David says, I will build you a house, right? God says, when have I ever needed a house? And you can't do it. There's blood on your hands, right? And so he never has to... when he does eventually do what God had asked him to do, which is liberate the Israelites from Egypt, what does he never have to do? he never has to lift his hand against anyone again. Instead, he just lifts it into the air and hopes that something happens because of it. There's a narrative connection there in terms of the imagery. So he raises his hand against the Egyptian, right? Yeah, and so in the future, he raises his hand, but only into the air with a stick, right? And so instead, he lifts his hands into the air and hopes that something crazy is going to happen with the 10 plagues and so on. Notice again, there's a sophisticated strategy. The hand is being raised, right? That's the narrative image that's being given to us. Moses raises his hand multiple times through his narrative. Sometimes it ends in the murder. Sometimes it ends in the breaking of a stone and water rushes out and it disqualifies him from the promised land, right? And so we need to pay close attention to any time a character is making a decision. You can think of a character's move or a decision as a touch point. This is a good moment to try and examine what changes because of this decision. Is it a good change or a bad change? Does it problematize God's plan or does it help, right? And so this is exactly what Bar Ephrat is saying, Shimon Bar Ephrat. So just that the simple point has been helpful for me. Just that simple point of narrative, characters within a narrative are being evaluated by the narration of the consequences of decisions, right? It also complicates things, though, right? For us, it clarified a lot for me, but this small little change in our reading will also complicate the reading of the narratives because that means we have to hold an open hand to very familiar narratives. Familiar narratives where we've practiced and rehearsed certain kinds of readings that are now problematized by a close reading of the text, right? The character, because now we have to look at characters' choices and be like, is this particular choice, this particular decision that this character has made, is it being held up as a model or is it actually a cautionary tale, right? And I've come to use instead of the metaphor that these Old Testament characters are models or hero examples, I no longer use that metaphor. I think it's more that these characters are mirrors for self-reflection. They're actually being held up for us to examine ourselves against, right? Not necessarily for or against, but to simply look at each character and then examine ourselves with these characters as a mirror. In other words, we're meant to identify with and see ourselves in these characters, in their flaws and in their triumphs, right? And we're meant to see ourselves and ask what we would do. So it's a different way of doing that very Campus Crusade for Christ's way of what does this narrative mean for you? So essentially, we let the course of the character's story become instructive for us, positively or negatively, right? Become instructive for us in how I might or might not want to make similar decisions or not. So let me just land this point right here. Thoughts or questions about the narrative ethical worldview? So characters as vehicles of ethical worldview within the biblical texts. Any questions before we move on? Yeah, and so this is actually what makes the biblical text so dynamic, is that when you do read a passage and then you look at a character, you are actually coming into contact with something that has potential to critique you or to bolster or to do something complicated with you. And this is exactly how the narrator chooses to put the ball in your court to make the connections, right? And so when a narrator is painting the picture of a character and they have very specific intent, which as we've seen from all of our studies in the past through poetry and now in narratives, everything is intentional. And so when you're looking at a character and they're described in very specific ways and how they're not described, right? If you, this is a great question. Many, Christian art, students of Christian art history have tried to paint certain biblical characters based purely on the way they're described in Scripture, and it's almost impossible to draw them because we're not given a lot of physical details about these characters oftentimes, right? We just import basic Mediterranean looks into them, right? But oftentimes they're not described at all. And so when you have a narrator actually painting a picture of a character, they have very specific intent. So you have to pay attention to what details they give you about a character and what details they don't give you about a character. And more often than not, they're not giving you details about a character, right? And so they're kind of giving it to your judgment to make. So how does this work when a narrator is actually doing this with the voice of God, right? That we can ask questions ethically about whether a character did something right or wrong. Are we invited to ask whether this is really God speaking or not speaking, particularly in passages where it seems like God is doing things that are unethical? This is an issue for a lot of Old Testament passages, right? Many people who read Old Testament passages or Hebrew Bible passages will have issues with the way that God is being portrayed, that according to them is unethical, and maybe even according to me would be unethical, right? This is a very difficult thing, right? So this is welcome to the wonderfully complex story of the Hebrew Bible. It is complex, and it is telling very epic stories, right? And it's such a good question because it's hard, and it's very hard to talk about in the abstract. But do you guys get what I'm asking? Is that when we're talking about character in the Bible is narrative, right? Written in poetic style, filled with discourse and long-form narrative. God is a character within this Bible, right? And we already talked about how characters are put forth as moral, they're used as leverages or hinge points that the author will tell us the narrative ethical worldview. And so what about for God, right? This is the complex question and story of reading the Hebrew Bible. So we're going to look at a narrative. We're going to look at this complex question in narrative example in just a little bit, but I'm going to put that question on your radar. God as unethical. God as unethical character. Right? Because it's really quite easy to read some actions of God is questionable. For example, just think of some. Let's see if we can get some examples from the group. For me, one that really seems unethical to begin with is God testing Abraham with his son Isaac at the mountain. Right? It seems really quite jarring to hear that God would want Abraham to kill his own son, right? Before you even get to Jesus, before you even know who Jesus is and what God will do with his own son, this is a pretty standout story that some people like, how morbid and how grotesque. What are some other stories that might 40 years of wandering. Sure, 40 years of wandering. Some people will point to the plague, the 10th plague, right? Did really even Egyptian children have to die? Right? And it seems like if it's just painting the top of your doorframe, that would spare you, right? And so these are challenging questions. We might be able to, we might have cobbled together a basic theology that allows us to apologize for it a little bit, but if we're honest with ourselves, those are quite standout. And sometimes talking with non-believers, and oftentimes talking with non-believers about this, it's a challenging topic to broach, right? So we're going to look at these we're going to look at this problem from a specific narrative example in a little bit, but that question is front and center for us, right? And I think that's all I'll say for the moment, right? Any other thoughts or questions about this? Okay, so this strategy of reading the Hebrew Bible is quite foreign to us as modern readers of the Bible who grow up in fairly evangelical circles, right? This may not even be relevant to us, so we might not even talk about it. But I think let me see. In most cultures that have developed intentional, artistic, crafted forms of storytelling, this is a thing, right? Questioning each character, questioning each decision. So for a lot of ancient traditions, this is normal. So if you've ever observed a Passover Seder, you know that it's the responsibility of the children to ask the patriarch of the family questions. Why do we hide the bread, right? So this is built into the tradition to ask very difficult questions about the stories. And so it's part of their tradition. But except for us, we usually will memorize points, and those points are answers. And asking questions is doubt. And if you have more questions, you should take an apologetics class. That's usually how we handle things in the evangelical circle, right? And so for myself, I don't read novels as nearly or as often as I should, but I've tried to work through myself the list of the 100 great classics of Western civilization over the last 5 years or so, and I've gotten quite a bit through. But if you've ever read good classic literature, this is basic for classic literature. It doesn't handhold you through the story, right? And so for many of us who no longer read long-form literature, and for many of us who no longer watch challenging cinema and only watch entertaining, fun cinema or Korean dramas, sometimes we don't exercise the complexity or thinking in complex terms. That's not a knock towards those other forms of media. It's just that what we result in is an underdeveloped following complex narrative, right? And so we don't think about complex characters anymore. So the reason literature and novels can become classics is not actually by putting the cookies on the bottom shelf so that anybody can get them, right? The way that classics become classics is by making you participate in the complexity of the characters of the story. And so that's how actually we experience life. We have to wade through a lot of complexities. And so I don't know what to say or do half the time that I'm reading like a long-form narrative, except that I sit with a character and really wrestle with what they're experiencing, right? And so I think we find value in the telling of complex character portrayals. For you guys, what are some of your favorite characters that you've ever written or watched on screen or TV? Yeah, favorite characters.
Snape.
Yeah, okay, Severus Snape from Lord Harry Potter. What? Atticus Finch from To Kill a Mockingbird, right? And so we actually find value in the ways that certain characters are portrayed, right? For example, if you take Severus Snape, Severus Snape is, for most of the series, portrayed as a villain. At the very beginning, he's portrayed as just like a grumpy professor. And then he gets more and more sinister, and then towards the end, if this is a spoiler, I'm sorry, but he actually has been working for the good behind the scenes for all of the books. And that's a complete reversal. Yeah, and so we find value in this kind of character, right? And so what's surprising is that the biblical authors are doing this in a very early period of the written art, right? In the early period of the art of narrative storytelling. So when these narratives are coming into existence, we don't have any equivalent examples, because the ancient Israelites were some of the first to actually put forth long-form writing like this, right? And so when you look at their neighbors from Babylonia or Egypt or Canaanite, the Canaanite historical record, the kind of narrative and the levels of nuance and the strategies at work are uniquely biblical and Israelite. And so here, this is from Robert Alter. Here's a quote from Robert Alter. He's making the same point. He says, "The Greek storytelling tendency of loading the story with details, giving you even more than what you need to understand, this is one that modern literary practice has by and large adopted and developed. Famously, Les Mis or War and Peace, These are great classics, and there will be whole chapters on the background of a character, sometimes 50, 60, 70, 80 pages on end, who will only play a subplot or a sub-role in the whole story and will appear once and then never again. Or famously, the gutters of Paris in Les Mis are very described in more detail than anybody ever needed to know. That's what he's talking about. This is actually a part of Greek storytelling. If you've ever read the Iliad and the Odyssey, sometimes it's just a whole poem on a memory about Aphrodite favoring, what's his name? I forget his name. He's the hero of Troy. No, it doesn't matter. But she sees him, Achilles, and she sees Achilles, and she just waxes poetic. So part of Greek storytelling is to overload with details, and much of Western literature and what we have is like this. It's over-explanatory, right? And that's not a bad thing per se. It's just a style, right? And so he says precisely for that reason, we have to adjust our habits as readers to read pre-Greek text in order to bring an adequate attentiveness to the rather different narrative maneuvers characteristic of the Hebrew Bible. So the underlying biblical conception of people's character is that they're unpredictable, constantly emerging and slipping back into ambiguity. If you've ever read the Bible and you try to describe any one character from the Old Testament, it's actually quite hard to say a lot about them, which is why if you ever go to a Catholic church or a or a Ethiopian Orthodox church, there's a lot of tradition surrounding the characters, but none of them are squarely within the biblical text. And that's by design, right? It begs for reflection. And so thus, biblical narrative style is marked by, and Robert Alter coined this phrase, the art of reticence, right? So he calls it the art of reticence. Does anybody know what reticence means? It's a restraint. So reticence just means restraint or reservation. So the biblical authors practice the art of reticence, meaning that they hold back so much. Many of us if you are a student of the New Testament, then you're reading post-Greek style, right? You're reading post-Homer. So you're reading details, you're reading a different kind of writing. But if you're reading the Hebrew Bible, this is a very different style. This is pre-Greek. This is pre-Alexander. So nobody's reading Greek or telling stories like Greeks. They're still telling stories like the people from the Levantine, right? So people from the eastern part of the Mediterranean, right? And so they hold back a lot of things. We call this dealing with lacunae, this is just Latin for gap, right? And so many of us so for us, we deal with the gaps. So anytime you read a Hebrew Bible story, you actually have to admit that there are gaps in storytelling. And that's by design, right? And so here's another example of it. So this is from the Jewish scholar Adele Berlin. She compares the art of reticence to Impressionist art. So you might have this in your notes, right? So I have one on your notes. You probably have a painting, right? Do you have a painting in 21? You should probably have a painting. No? Oh, I should have included it. But you can look at it. It's one of the most famous Impressionist paintings by, let me see if I can pull it up here. Ooh, I didn't add it to the notes. Yeah, I didn't add it to the notes. That's okay. So if you've ever looked at Impressionist art, you might know some famous Impressionist artists. No, that's Cubism. Impressionism, like Claude Monet, right? Or Pierre Auguste Renoir. So Renoir. So if you've ever looked at Impressionist art, you can just go on your phone right now and look up Impressionist art. What you'll find is that from a distance you can see a picture, right? This is things like pointillism, right, where people are just going like, right, and then there are lots of dots. And from a distance, the use of the points and the way that they're organized and connected to one another, it looks like a realistic portrait. Famously, there's water lilies, there's like a tea service by the river, right? But the moment you get close to the painting, it's just dots. Nothing's connecting them, right? It's just dots and little tiny strokes. It's incomprehensible up close and puzzling up close. But the clarity emerges as you zoom out, right? And that's what's happening, is actually your mind is inferring and creating detail that consists really of just these tiny ambiguous dots, right? These small ambiguous little strokes, but from a distance your brain learns to connect them and create images and make sense in spite of and oftentimes because of the ambiguity in between the dots, right? If I space these ones different from these, it communicates to me separation of maybe somebody's arm or something like that. And so Berlin compares Impressionist art to this biblical narrative style when it comes to characters. It's pretty brilliant. So she says this: in Impressionist art, the suggestion of a thing may be more convincing than the detailed portrayal. This is due to the tendency of our brains to project meaning onto images in order to complete our expectations of a thing. We see what we expect to see, and the surrounding information guides our perception. This is why we fill in a partially drawn figure to conform to our expectations. Have you ever looked at a painting and you don't have a category for what it is yet? And your brain is just putting out guesses as to what is this thing? What could this be? It's like looking at a silhouette, right? And then once you see what you think it is or what it actually is, you can't go back and see it unscrambled, right? You can't see it the way that your brain was trying to see it before until you saw it. This is really heady, but, right, it's things that you can't unknow, right? Once you know it, there's no going back to not knowing it, right? And so this happens all the time in experiencing art. It's like once you've broken the seal, you can't put it back in almost, right? If you've seen the movie all the way through, you know how it goes. You can't unsee the ending, right? Oftentimes our brain tries to fit these foreign visuals with scenes that we're actually used to, and our brains are constantly imposing order onto things. And then when you meet something new that doesn't fit what your brain has already grown accustomed to, that's growth and challenge, right? And there's opportunity for you to learn something or to turn away, right? So our brains are creating more order than is actually there in any given situation. So this is important for us as we read biblical narrative. So when we do read biblical narrative, and then you read a story that goes all the way through, like, say, 4 chapters, oftentimes in 4 chapters, we're already filling in gaps for why certain characters did what they did. Regardless of whether or not the narrative lets us, that's how we treat ambiguity when we read fast, right? So when you talk about, say, Abraham using Hagar to have a child, oftentimes we'll say he really shouldn't have done that because why? Why shouldn't Abraham have done that to Hagar? Why shouldn't he have? Why was it? Why? Right? Because we know he shouldn't have because God scolds him for it. But oftentimes we differ on why he shouldn't have.
Because there is a promise. He said that no.
Yeah. So on the one hand, we might say that Abraham shouldn't have done it because God already promised, and it would be Sarah, right? But on the other hand, he should not have done that to a slave, right? He had no right to do that to a slave, to impregnate her, and then when it caused problems in his marriage, he kicked her out to the curb.
But Sarah was,
Sarah wanted it at first, right? She was adamant that it should happen at first,
take her,
right? Yes.
take the child.
Yeah, but then once Abraham starts getting sweet on her, it becomes very challenging, right? And so if we read slower, it's not as simple as, because on the one hand, it is true that God already promised, right? But what do we learn from from how God scolds Abraham? He will be faithful to the promise regardless of that, right? He's going to prosper Ishmael, right? He's going to make sure that they survive. Because you're not going to be punished for what your father has done, right? And so but oftentimes our brain will fill in gaps, fill in patterns for us, right? So this is true when we're reading narratives, right? So Adele Berlin says, this is why we fill in partially drawn figures to conform to our expectations. And in some cases, too much information will destroy the image. Right? So the trick is, from the artist's point of view, is how much detail to include and how much to exclude. Right? And so she applies that to biblical narrative. Right? This is a good corrective for those who wish biblical stories provided more concrete detail. Right? Sometimes, especially when I work with high schoolers or with college students, they want to say, why doesn't the Bible just get a little bit more clear? Why didn't they just say that? But it's precisely because that's not their narrative technique, right? The gaps left in biblical narratives are intentional, so that with a few deft strokes of the pen, the biblical author engages the imagination of the reader to construct a picture that's more real than if they had overloaded it with detail, right? More than if he had filled in David or Abraham or Joseph's portrait with more details, right? Minimal representation can give maximal illusion, right? And so she's a good writer too, so, right, this is her quote. In other words, think about Jonah. Why did Jonah run? Even if you don't know it, you're already unconsciously filling Jonah's motives in, right? So much so that you go the whole book having already filled in Jonah's motives until at the final chapter he gives it to you. And you may have expected it, but likely you didn't, right? And so the narrator holds his motives until they give you closure at the very end. And this happens all the time. You have to ask, why did Abraham do that? Why did Moses say that? Right? This is classic biblical style, because they'll usually do something and they don't explain why, and you're left with asking, why did he do that? Right? Like when Moses smashes the rock, it actually doesn't tell us why he did, right? Only the retribution of God is what teaches us why he did it, right? So this is what you have to do when you're reading the biblical narrative, that every time you step into the Hebrew Bible, you're in the presence of a master narrator who is intentionally leaving details out for you, right? And I found in my own experience, and I think Westerners, we experience this as primitive. So if you've ever done an English class, they might call biblical narrative primitive writing, right? Which is actually quite arrogant, right? It's like the biblical stories are actually poorly told stories. They contradict themselves. They don't tell you enough detail, and nobody thinks to ask, what if they intentionally are contradicting themselves? What if they intentionally are leaving out details for you, right? And so it's a conversion of our imagination to see that all of the Hebrew Bible is deliberate, even the perceived contradictions. And so the biblical authors don't owe you anything. They don't have to tell you anything. They don't have to over-explain anything to you. You are only told what the biblical authors have told you, and that is how they chose to write, right? So it's like if you're on a roller coaster where every little jostle and shift of gravity and body weight that you're experiencing, that's intentional, right? They put a little curve here, and they want you to feel that gravitational force. And the result of a mind, and you have to learn how to self-reflect on what's happening to to see this is that the result of a mind that isn't trained to do this will skate by biblical narrative and fail to see the big picture, right? So that's just a general principle that I found immensely helpful in biblical characterization, right? And then we'll close here. Again, notice in order to make our coping strategy of making them hero examples, what we're usually doing with the coping strategy of a hero example is filling in gaps to make it more clear to us, or to make the story more morally transparent than it actually is in the biblical account. So if you've ever read a hero example story, somebody pick a biblical story right now where you often heroize the character. Okay, Daniel's a particularly difficult one because he's actually supposed to be that way. He's designed to be read as a hero, right? Okay, Jonah, but we've already talked about Jonah. This is another one. What was that? What was that?
The son of Jonathan was slain.
Oh, sure. Or even just David. Let's do, David or Jonathan, but David is the main character. So oftentimes we will take the David character, and then we will take a story of David, and then fill in the gap for why it was okay for him to do that, right? Right? So when you're given in the story of the kings, David conquering the lands at the borders of Israel, oftentimes we don't bat an eyelid at it, right? As like, David is fighting for the Lord or something like that. Oftentimes that's what we say. But remember, there's this one passage where David is taking a census, and the rage of God burns hot for David because he's conscripting people for his army. And then there's a significant narrative detail that every time David conquers it, he names it after himself. Right? He says, "And I'm making a name for myself in that city." That should remind you of what? The Babel. When we're going to make our name for ourselves, right? This is very, very tragic, right? The David figure. But oftentimes we don't we see one of David's only failures is Bathsheba, right? But actually David's whole life, for years after the Bathsheba moment, he ruled as king for quite a long time before he even realized he shouldn't have done what he did, right? And the whole time he was making war. And so we might ask, of course Babylon will come eventually because they were nipping at the heels of a growing empire, right? And so oftentimes we fill in the gaps by making David a hero, or by making Noah a hero, or by making Saul a hero, right? We try and make it morally simple when actually it's morally complex, right? David is a man after God's own heart, but at his best. But like Moses at his worst, he was a murderer, right? And it disqualifies him, right? And that's exactly the silhouette, right? Sometimes we'll do this with the prophets, right? Like Elijah, right? Elijah we know is this very zealous prophet. But Elijah also, as we're told, committed mass murder on a mountain, right? And then when he was being chased by the government, he was saying, why are they chasing me? I'm being faithful to the Lord. But you actually murdered in cold blood. Or the time when the youths called him Baldy, and then he used the Spirit to call bears to maul the children, right? That's a story in our Bible. Teenagers. And so, right, we actually make things too simple. And so we're going to actually just read a bunch of stories in the sessions to come. But just on a general point here where we're going to land, thoughts and reflections before I land the plane here. Any thoughts about what we just talked about? Okay, good. So here's where I'll end. So why I like using the example of polygamy It's because it's pervasive throughout the biblical narrative, right? Almost everybody struggles with it. And I like using that to illustrate the point of biblical characters and sort of moral, ethical worldviews is because the Bible presents the idea of polygamy and monogamy at the beginning of the story, right? In Genesis, you're given an ideal. And then when we get to reading the body of the Scripture, we get to see through the characters' choices the outcome of polygamy, right? We get to see the outcome, right? And I think learning to see the characters as vehicles for moral, narrating moral outcomes and consequences, it takes a huge load off of the characters in our Bibles. It takes a huge load off the shoulders of the characters because I think before, at least for me growing up, we get used to reading all of these characters as heroes, right? We get used to reading them as heroes, and then once you get older and start to read the complexity back into the character, it starts to break a little bit our understanding of these characters, like Moses and Abraham as models or something. But then because they're so important, you take the way they lived also as trying to find lessons among their lives. So like, you should look at the life of Noah and look at lessons on faithfulness, right? And we try and heroize them in that way. But when you see it in this way, where characters are merely vehicles for the outcomes of moral choices, then you just see these characters, and they're living their lives, and then you can examine the outcomes. That's all you're doing. And you no longer read the Bible looking for heroes out of these characters because they're not, right? They're characters just as human as you and I, who are in relationship with God, and their stories are being told and made as examples for us to examine the ways that things can really go wrong and ways that it can go right. And so we're really just reflecting off of these characters as mirrors, not going out into the Hebrew Bible looking for heroes to follow, right? Because the Torah reminds us that none of these people are the ones that you should follow, right? Nobody like Moses. And Moses wasn't even the one we should follow because they didn't even follow him into the promised land. He led them, but they had to go without him, right? Yeah, and so this is where we have to remember that none of these characters are heroes. They're simply people who are navigating the relationship with God, right? And this is where we are as well. And so they're just normal people like you and me, and you can see the consequences, right? Sometimes they get it right, but often they don't. And again, I think it's relieving to see those characters in that light because then it takes a huge load off of our shoulders to try and emulate Noah at every turn, right? Because I don't think the biblical authors wanted me to follow Noah, right? They wanted me to learn from Noah, right? Because that's not the point of the Hebrew Bible. All right, any other questions before we close?
So how did the Bible describe them, all of these people? In Hebrews, they are witnesses, just witnesses.
Yeah, just witnesses.
Surrounded by these witnesses who have.
Yeah, exactly. And so to be a witness is merely to have seen an experience. There's nothing about that they succeeded at a task or anything like that, but their faithfulness was that they experienced, right? For good and for bad, exactly. And so our goal is to read the Scriptures and see how God is still moving and faithful throughout all of the twists and turns of the narrative.
That makes sense. And that's why Hebrews 11, and then by Hebrews 12, what is Hebrews 12? Look unto Jesus.
Yeah, exactly. They're all pointing, right? And so this is supposed to get us to the idea of the silhouette, is that each character is only in service to seeing God's hand in the story, right? Because one way to read the biblical story is that humanity, or Adam and Eve, or man and life were in the garden together with God. The project was derailed, but God didn't give up. How is it that these broken, fragmented humans continued to experience God and continue to walk and go away from him, yet God is still present, right? And then so the consummation of the story is that God finally brings the two that have been torn apart together, right? And so in what he will call the marriage, right? Or sorry, what the author of Revelation will call the marriage, right? Which is given to us at the beginning, right? Man and wife he'll leave the father and become one, right? Two will become one. And so here we are at a pretty significant touch point for the way we read characters, right? It's a really minor change in reading, but the weight that it moves for us, it's a pretty strong lever. So I think it's an important one to integrate into the way that we read. We have to read the text, truly. Yeah, and so I think a good practice for us is when you're reading a story, identify the characters, right? What seems like an important character, right? And to be honest, we are not reading like literature oftentimes, so we often only take the most obvious characters, like Moses, Aaron, Miriam, right? We won't examine like if you're reading the story of Exodus, we probably won't read the word of the Lord as a character. But if you actually read Hebrew, the word of the Lord is actually a subject with verbs. So the word of the Lord stands before Moses, right? And so the word of the Lord is a character oftentimes. Or if you're in the Samuel story, then the word of the Lord was standing next to Samuel, right? Something like that. And so read slowly, read carefully. What has action? What is the subject? What are the characters, right? Sometimes it's trees. Sometimes it's an animal. In Jonah, they're cows, right? And so the great whale is a character. And how they're portrayed and how they're not portrayed is important for us. If one little exercise. So if you have your Bibles, go to the story of Saul when he gets chosen.
Yeah. That's a
Right?
good example because I was reading the text.
Yeah.
What is the description of Saul? Now I realize. Tall.
Yeah. And in that particular story, so were all of David's brothers. Tall, good-looking, and handsome, right? I think Saul is a head above the rest, something like that, right? But then it's juxtaposed to what? He's hiding in the luggage, right? Saul is hiding in the luggage. For such a great man, he's fearful of power, and that fear of power is what causes him to capitulate in the Amalekites, right? But David is small, right? But bold, right? If too bold, right? Confront Goliath. And so those are important ways to read characters. Saul and David are pretty obvious, but then now we have to attend to all the other characters that we have read in our Bibles. And I think it's a good starting point for us. Cool. I'll close us in prayer, and then we can wrap up. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for this time that you've given us once again to really ponder your stories and to think on the way that your word has been preserved for us throughout the years and throughout the centuries, Lord, and in such a way that we can read it online or in a book, Lord. And as we continue to try and experience life and relationship with you, may we learn to use this text as a tool to better understand and see what you're up to in the world. In your name we pray. Amen.